kick us off. It's good now to kick us off. All right, cool. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us for our USA Cycling Inclusion Conference. If you weren't on the other session, again, my name is Ashland Johnson. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the president and founder of the Inclusion Playbook. We're a sports impact group that empowers community leaders to change their communities in and through sports. I'm a civil rights lawyer and sports equity strategist who has worked at the intersection of sports and social justice for nearly a decade. So we're all really excited to be here with you to discuss some of the most important issues in and around sports today. So during this conversation, we will hear from experts and trailblazers in the sports diversity, equity, inclusion space. We will be focusing on why and how to engage diverse and underrepresented communities in sport. So in a few minutes, we're going to introduce our amazing speakers for this session. But before we get started, I just want to make a few quick points. While we will be recording this call, today's call is off the record. It's an off-the-record community call and is not intended to be a media update. If you are a journalist, you're welcome to stay on in your own personal capacity, but for official inquiries, please contact us and we'll get you to the right person. Also, Liam will be our room facilitator. He'll be monitoring live Q&A and be handling any tech questions. And then lastly, just a quick housekeeping point of order. On the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box for you to submit questions. If you have any questions that you want to answer throughout the webinar, please just put them in the Q&A box and we'll be happy to answer them throughout. We want this to be an organic discussion, so you don't have to hold your discussion or your questions to the end. Again, if you put them in the Q&A box, we'll ask them throughout the conversation. So now I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists for our Engaging Diverse and Underrepresented Communities session. We have Suzy. Suzy, if you want to say a few words.
Hi, everybody. I'm Suzy Sanchez, the Senior Manager of DEI and Community Programs at USA Cycling. I have been a DEI practitioner for 7 years. Previously, I managed DEI programs at another NGB at USA Weightlifting. I've worked in the Olympic and Paralympic movement on and off since 2013, and then am a former elite athlete in the sport of weightlifting. And I just have a huge passion for providing accessibility to sport, because for me, sport saves lives and provides community. And I think that ultimately that's what we're all trying to achieve, is finding where we belong in the world.
Thank you. Next, Shannon.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shannon Jolly. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Senior Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for USA Fencing. So I've been outside of USA Fencing doing DEI work within the consultant space for the NCAA and a few other NGBs as well. So super excited to be here with you all.
Next, Connor.
Yeah, good morning. Currently, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Compete Sports Diversity, but I got most of my expertise within the Olympic movement. So I've worked for several different NGBs, including USA Fencing. I was their national events manager, and then I went over to be director at USA Racquetball. And so operations is really my bread and butter, but I've been speaking on DEI work for about 11 years now. I was just counting this morning. And I specialize in the Olympic movement side of it, specifically trans athletes in the Olympic movement. And our organization currently works nationwide to help bolster disenfranchised communities around the U.S., specifically with small sports leagues.
And finally, Lani.
Hi, good morning. I'm Lani Woods. I am a community outreach advocate, formerly the coordinator for USA Cycling Search for Speed. I also work with clubs such as KRT, QRT, which is Kings Rule Together, Queens Rule Together, here in Los Angeles, and I work with the organization LA Bike Academy here in Los Angeles. I am a ultra endurance athlete recreationally, and I have recently got into cycling. So I've been cycling for about 2 years, and I've tried almost every discipline of cycling, trying to figure out where I fit. I'm passionate about getting more people into non-traditional sports in general. So right now, cycling is my assignment, and I like getting all minorities into the sport and trying to find ways for more people to access the sport.
Excellent, excellent. So this first question is going to be for everyone. We'll start with Suzy. But I'm going to ask you all, can you each just tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you've engaged with bringing your sport or organization to diverse audiences? So Suzy?
Yeah, so in my role at USA Cycling, I've had the opportunity to create structures for different programming to help create more inclusive spaces in the world of cycling. So in cycling, within USA Cycling as a whole, it is a predominantly male sport, predominantly white represented, which is fine, right? Like that's the reality of many spaces, especially in the Olympic and Paralympic movement. And what I found is that there are so many people who want to bring more folks in, right? They're not just wanting to kind of keep this space to themselves. They want to bring more folks in. They just don't know how. So a lot of the work that I've been doing has been built around providing education. So that's internal education to our staff, external education to our coaches through our monthly inclusive coaching essentials training that we're doing, and then working directly with clubs to help them learn the language of what it means to do outreach. And when I say learn the language, I mean, most folks think like when they're doing outreach that they just send an email to like a boys and girls club and they're like, hey, come to my facility and or come join my community ride and we're going to offer it for free. And that's awesome. And that's a great place to get started. But there's a huge gap that we have to clear in order to even get people to that point, right? And that includes like having the conversation around, okay, well, awesome. You're reaching out to this boys and girls club. They only have hours between like, I don't know, let's say 12 and 2, and they don't have a way to get these kids from their facility to where you're doing this community ride. So that's our first challenge. They don't have equipment. So do you have equipment that you're providing? And did you include that in your initial outreach email? And if not, you need to consider that for future outreach. So having conversations and kind of facilitating these like thinking meetings where we're like, hey, let's think through this great idea that you have, and let's identify all of these other missing pieces to ensure that you accomplish what you're trying to accomplish and that we can actually mutually accomplish what we want, which is more representation in cycling from minority communities. So that's kind of where I've been fitting in lately in that space.
All right, thank you. All right, so
Yeah.
Shannon, can you talk a little bit more about who you are and how you engage in bringing your sport to diverse audiences?
Yes. So very similar to what Suzy just mentioned, I would say that fencing pretty much has the same demographic, predominantly white, male, higher middle class, from a socioeconomic status. So a lot of the work that I've done from an internal perspective, very similar again to Suzy, where making sure that we're having this awareness and understanding, and that could be from, the scale of cultural consciousness or cultural competency, but also going through simple trainings of how do you handle conflict and how do you handle resistance and things of the sort. So that's a lot of the internal things have been around the educational side of things, but from an external side, more looking at programming. So again, the whole point is if we know where we're starting demographically, how do we start to create this change? And so a lot of the work is identifying those pockets. And again, similar to what Suzy said, again, if you want to target these communities, a lot of our work is based around meeting people where they are. Or as you hear a lot of times, people always say empathy, which also includes meeting people where they are. So a lot of the programming has been, okay, if we know financing a lot of this, the equipment, getting to NACs is what we call them for our major national events. So things like that, identifying, again, how do we mitigate some of those barriers to the sport? So we created, some programming that kind of hit a lot of those pockets. And then in addition, we try to like incentivize our clubs to do this work as well by offering the grants that encourage, are you looking at women and girls? Are you looking at persons with disabilities, people of color? So a lot of our programming is really geared towards that. And then from a strategic partnership side, again, understanding the limitations that we have as a national office, relying on some of our partners to get funding, to get equipment to different clubs. So yes, very robust, but in short, again, just making sure that we're identifying pockets of opportunity that still align with our overarching goal, but we're still continuing to grow the sport.
Thank you. Connor, how about you next? Just tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you've engaged with bringing sports to diverse audiences.
Yeah, of course. So the work that we do with Compete, we operate more of a marketing and consulting DEI-based organization. So we do a lot of education that became very prevalent, I would say, right after COVID. Prior to COVID, I was president of the board of this company, and we did a little bit more of the sports engagement. So we would work with smaller disenfranchised sports leagues and sports owners, and we would work on providing sponsorship dollars to them specifically. So we had the resources to reach out and attract some of these larger organizations. Currently, our largest partners right now are Cintas, AARP, and JP Morgan Chase. And they're organizations that work with us. And then we have the conversations and say, look, you know, these smaller organizations are volunteer based. And that's one of the biggest pieces that I didn't quite understand when I came from the Olympic movement is the NGBs that I worked for, whereas they are 501c3 nonprofits and they are smaller, and sometimes they do operate with disenfranchised organizations or specifically people. And I've seen a lot of really good stuff come out of that, specifically with the DEI action plans that have been produced by a lot of NGBs, which has been fantastic, but they do still have a staff. And that's beneficial. So working with these organizations that typically would email me, you know, after 5 p.m. at night when they get off of work, and then we have to work on their operations. So some of them are running very large events. We work specifically with International Pride Softball, formerly NAGA, which runs the Gay World Series. They've been a partner for about 15 years, and then we work with NGFFL as well, that does the Gay Bowl. And last year we helped them allocate their resources in Seattle, but we also got them the partnership with the Seattle Seahawks. We have a portfolio of about 7 now. If cross my fingers, you said this wasn't a public meeting. If all goes well with Cronky Sports, we will potentially have 11 pro teams under our portfolio. And they're looking for similar things that, you know, we all are. They're just looking for opportunities to spend their dollars and to really show their support. They just don't really know the best places to do it. So we act as sort of that big brother program, if you will. And then we work with those organizations and say, look, I know you got a full-time job. I know you're a volunteer-based organization. You still have 9 events on your calendar. They may be 200 athletes and some of them may be 500 athletes, but we help operate in getting them volunteers specifically, but also those dollars that can help, you know, make a difference. For some of these organizations, a simple $5,000 check is a game changer to them. Granted, the Gay Bowl is more of a $100,000 check, but regardless, those are things that we can help operate, and we can really kind of dig our hands deep where those volunteer-based organizations, and as most of you know, specifically, they are underserved, not just in terms of financial capabilities, but across the board. You know, some of these organizations don't have the experience or intellectual capital to stand in front of Cintas Corporation and make a pitch that they're going to listen to. So that's where we kind of work with holding their hands and try and push those dollars to them. But the educational piece, and this is what I was mentioning, is after COVID, I mean, you all probably know this better than I do. The political system in the US has become so different than it was 5 years ago. And the education for a lot of the organizations we work with have become a lot more important. So the sponsorship packages, the partnership packages, memberships that we're working with our organization to get access to our sports organizers, they now also almost always 75% of the time include an educational piece where we go and help host, you know, a diversity summit for them, whether it's a community-based organization or it's a larger corporation or it's a pro sports team or even a city. We work with a lot of cities around the US, and they want an educational aspect within their package. And so having access to all of the resources and network we do, we add that in there. And our new chief of education, who just started about 8 months ago, is in charge of all of that, and he's fantastic.
All right, Lani, same question to you. Just tell us a little bit more about who you are and the work that you're doing, to engage with diverse communities.
Okay, wow. You guys are incredible. So a little bit about myself. First and foremost, I'm a mom. Next, I'm an athlete, and things that I'm doing to engage with diverse communities. I am diverse communities, but I started off with creating platforms to share the stories of diverse communities. I have a podcast called Unrelenting Humans where I share the stories of adaptive athletes and injured athletes. Also a podcast called Black with Endurance, sharing the stories of Black athletes in the endurance space that, don't get highlighted, because I think one of the key things that is missing in every discipline is exposure. Currently, I'm more boots on the ground. So I help out where I can, wherever I see it's needed. I call it connect dots. So when I find opportunities, I try to find athletes, specifically athletes of color that will, fit into those spaces or whatever the need is. More recently, I think that more people are familiar with my work with Search for Speed, where I started off just doing the tryouts and became the coordinator for that and helping, I guess, diversify the outcome of the athletes that were found. And I guess more recently, things that I'm working on is we just launched the KRT QRT race team. So here in Los Angeles, we have a good amount of athletes, and I think, well, that's where I'm at right now.
Excellent, excellent. All right, great. You all are doing amazing things, and during later points of this discussion, we'll do a deeper dive into those things. The first question is going to be for Shannon now. So you've been doing great work moving DEI initiatives forward in a variety of NGBs, including your current position at USA Fencing. So what are some of the common challenges you see sports organizations facing that keep them from diversifying their sport?
Well, I think at the start of that would be the lack of investment or support from leadership. I think, obviously I'm speaking to the choir here when we're talking about the panel, but understanding that in order to really drive some positive change, you are going to take some intentionality, which also does require some monetary contributions as well. And so I think once you're able, and a lot of that too is making sure that you're able to effectively communicate the overarching goal. And so also recognizing that there is an ROI that will be received from this type of work, but it may not come in 3 months, it may not come in 6 months, but those conversions could turn up via memberships. Those conversions or that ROI would also show up via those partnerships that I mentioned, which once you're effectively giving the storytelling, the funds will start to come in, even if it's from donors, if it's from partners. That's how you can start there. So obviously the initial part is that investment and support from leadership. I would say, secondly, what you see is I would say, culturally informed strategy. So ideally, when you think about going and working with diverse populations or new touch points, it looks good. And so a lot of times, because that happens, it's not always well informed by what do we need to better meet the community, as we just talked about, that meeting people where we are part. So not fully understanding what are those barriers that exist. And so, one thing that I like to implement is when you're trying to create this community or membership that you want to see, you need to include them in the process of creating those programming. So understanding, well, for our community, a language barrier may exist. Understanding, again, the socioeconomics that exist. So understanding from those specific communities, what is needed to bring said sport to them. So that's also a lot of the part of that planning and pre-process, or what we like to call like a listening tour per se. And then I think afterwards, a lot of that, the common challenges is once you've engaged with that group, how do you make that sustainable or keep them engaged? And so that's where a lot of that work of like really working to enhance a culture or make people feel welcomed is a lot of the difficulty. And also, even once you've engaged with them, and a lot of that too is growing pains, because for example, we've done the same at USA Fencing, to where we initially dropped off equipment was free, we gave a curriculum, and then it was like, oh wait, that wasn't necessarily the best move when we think about sustainability. So, and that's the great thing about this type of work, is being able to pivot and recognize, okay, this didn't work, and let's change it a little bit. So figuring out a full-fledged, now that you've started said program, you've got the buy-in, but making sure that it's sustainable. So does that look like a train the trainer approach? For example, there's a new partner that we're working with, 2-for-1, to where they go out annually to do these trainings, make sure that they have access to curriculums, so that there's some type of sustainable buy-in from our partners in the community, but also from us as an organization. So those are just kind of the first three that come to mind.
Thank you. And Suzy, you've worked for a variety of NGBs as well, and you're now at USA Cycling. From the sports governance side, can you talk about USA Cycling or even some of the other organizations you work with, like what you're planning to do to grow the sport and engage underrepresented communities?
Yeah, so from a governance perspective, that's where we're talking about policy, right? Like what are we, that's at least that's what I'm hearing, right? I think that often, and I'll use USA Weightlifting as an example. So USA Weightlifting went through this whole like revamp of their governance structure because they wanted to create more inclusion at the leadership level. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with how NGBs are structured, you have your board of directors. They oversee kind of the strategic vision for the organization. And then underneath your board of directors, you have all of these like smaller committees. And all of those committees and all of the folks on the board, they're there to be the decision makers to decide how we're spending our money, where we're going as an organization. And then that informs how we as administrators, like the boots on the ground types, are using our budget, planning our time. So it really does, it's a top-down approach, much like most organizations. And at USA Weightlifting, they recognized, and this was probably like 6 years ago, that they had no representation on most of their committees and on their board. It was a mostly male board of directors, mostly male elderly folks who were on all of their committees. And because of that lack of diversity of thought, a lot of the decisions that were being made about how the organization was moving forward, it was actually keeping them stuck kind of in like 3 decades before where they actually needed to be. And so what they did was they actually updated their bylaws, and they had like working groups and discussions, and they brought folks in to have a conversation about why this was important and why they needed to ensure that there was diversity of thought on the board, and that could be achieved through having representation from women. At that point in time, they had 50%, it was almost exactly like 50-50, like male to female population within their organization, but their board was like 80-20 male to female population. So they changed their board makeup to specifically outline that they wanted to provide opportunities for women's representation. So 33% of their board needed to be female-led, 33% needed to be athlete-led. And through those changes, they actually accomplished what they were hoping for, so more diversity of thought. And as a result, they have since become a leader in the international space in the world of weightlifting and are now, heading into the Olympic Games, like having the most potential successful team that they've ever had simply by making that change within their policy and how they were planning to be governed. So I give this long-winded story to get to the point that it is all well and good to create programs and practices around inclusion and around bringing folks to the table. But if that is not codified in your like bylaws or in your policies, as soon as whoever the person is that may be advocating for that inclusion leaves the organization or leaves your team or leaves your club, there is no protection for those folks, right? Like these are minority populations that very much do rely on advocacy, and advocacy can get us in the door, but policy is what gets us that confirmed seat at the table. So with that being said, I do think that it's important for those of you that are joining and who will be listening later to consider how you have your organizations and your clubs and your teams set up. Do you have certain practices that you view as ways that you are creating inclusion on your team or in your club? And then are those practices able to be codified into policy to ensure that as times change, folks still have a seat at the table and still have an opportunity to be represented? So yeah.
Suzy, that's great. A lot of times you're right. People will focus on the programming or informal practices, but not like specifically the policies or things that are written down. And we've seen at times too, where people want to diversify their board. They can't figure out why they can't diversify the board. And we ask them what their give is, like how much does the board have to contribute monetarily in order to be a board member? And they're like, oh, it's low. It's like $10,000. And we're like, okay. That's
Yeah,
a lot of money, and that's a big barrier for people, especially people who are in underrepresented communities already. And so just adjusting some of those small policies can make big changes.
for sure.
So, Lani, this one's for you. So from your work managing community outreach for programs in LA, what insights can you give to listeners related to like reaching out to underrepresented communities in cycling? What have you learned from your work?
Well, when reaching out, I feel like a lot of organizations, they really don't engage much with other organizations that are already doing that kind of work in the community. So everyone wants to do it. Everyone has a common goal, but they're not like collaborating and working together. Um, so what I've like tried to do is connect some organizations with other organizations like schools and after school programs that have access to maybe funding or the youth but don't have access to the programming or in a case that's going on right now we have a school that wants programming, doesn't have access to bikes and stuff, but I have an organization that has bikes, but doesn't have a place to store them. So it's like connecting those dots there. That's what I'm doing currently right now. But what I was doing more or less the biggest barrier that I found is trying to describe and explain what like cycling is to people that don't cycle. And that's where I think everyone is kind of where the ball is being dropped is that no one knows what the sport of cycling is. Everyone knows riding a bike. But what we're doing to really highlight this actual sport of cycling and show people what is possible, where they can go with cycling, the different disciplines in cycling. Um, Sorry.
No, this is great. You're talking about being a connector, and I don't need to downplay that because that's big. Like a lot of people are trying to reinvent the wheel, or they're so busy doing their job, the job with their one organization, they don't have time to see the bigger picture. And for someone like you to come in and just say like, oh, again, it's not a big money ask. Like I need space for bikes. You have space for bikes. Like it's those little things too that can make such a big difference with connecting these communities.
Yeah. Also, it's what I notice is in the cycling community that they market to cyclists already, like people that are already in the community, the organizations that are already in the community, and there's not a lot of diversifying in sports, like collaborating with let's say an influencer or a gamer or an athlete in another sport instead of just trying to highlight or work with the top cyclist. So you diversify the sport more if you say you get someone like, I mean, just throwing names like LeBron James to ride a bike. Or if, whoever the top gamer is on YouTube talked about riding bikes or tried out riding a bike. So I think there is a lot of old thinking in the sport, and no one's really reaching out and getting new blood, new thoughts from outside of the sport. And that's probably the same in other sports. I think it's similar in the other sport I come from, which is obstacle course racing.
Oh, cool. Yeah, to what Susie's saying too, having like different people at the table that might have these different perspectives of like how to engage communities in more authentic ways. And
Yeah,
Connor mentioned this too, like sometimes people are just volunteers and this is maybe their third or fourth gig and they're not getting paid for this one, so they don't have time to think in those ways. So again, it's great that you're bringing like just a different view and different ways to connect with communities authentically, because you know that's important, especially if you're dealing with underrepresented communities. If you come at them in an unauthentic way, it's not going to be helpful.
exactly.
Yeah. So my next question is for Connor. You do great work at Compete Sports, highlighting underrepresented communities in athletics. Could you talk a little bit more about the communities that your organization highlights and the importance of storytelling in this space?
Yeah, for sure. So storytelling is very interesting for the DEI push, and I think it's important to also identify which areas you're actually targeting. I think step one, and unfortunately, step one gets missed more often than not. identifying your target audience is extremely important. Whether you are talking to V6, an organization in downtown Minneapolis that is working with underprivileged youth in some of the worst parts of the Minneapolis area, that conversation, that story is different, and engaging those kids is very different than if we were to walk into, well, our conversations with some of our corporate partners. Those conversations have to be very different. And so the communities that we highlight usually tend to be those underrepresented smaller sports organizers. But most of the time, at least when I speak and when our chief of education talks about his educational panels and his diversity summits, we understand that the DEI push and the idea of inclusion as a whole is no longer just a moral obligation. It's more of a strategic imperative. And this idea of building realistic measures and metrics around what this is going to result in, whether it is a activation of youth children like we just talked about, or whether it is an activation for a more relevant push for the LGBTQ+ community, which is something we are currently working on in the state of Florida. As many of you know, it's been difficult, but understanding exactly who our target audience is then allows us to start the storytelling process. I have seen multiple pitfalls when people approach those conversations and they think it's a silver bullet. It's a one size fits all, and that's so wrong, to be delicate. The idea of not understanding your target audience and then also not understanding exactly what part of DEI as a whole you are actually looking for. Creating an inclusive space doesn't just mean, oh, we're going to be including everybody for every reason. No, it means actual important, purposeful, and intentional identification of what target audience you're looking for, whether it is your specific NGB that has trouble recruiting athletes of color. If that's the problem you're trying to solve, then you can focus on that, and that becomes more of an inclusive environment with that idea of, hey, look, we're going to actually push for it. Maybe it's a women-based sport who is looking for more male engagement. That is a very real thing with artistic swimming right now, and that is a big push for them, and that's how they create a more inclusive space. So once that's identified, then the storytelling becomes important. And I think the easiest measure for the storytelling, at least the one I do, is I almost always think in threes, regardless of who I'm talking to. It's always number one, that minimal background of what kind of story you're trying to push. And then number two, what results are you trying to accomplish? And that's always has to be on the table. I think it is a misstep if you're not clear, or at least upfront, about the stories that you're trying to tell and the results you're trying to achieve. And there's nothing wrong with saying, look, I feel that this community is underrepresented. I feel that they have been dealt a rough set of cards. We are working to try and help them out. Our result is that you jump on board, both socially and second, financially. It's okay to look at somebody and say, look, our goal is to get you to financially support this. And then the third thing is to justify the reasons and look at some of the output and what the ROI is. At least from my perspective, I almost always think with more of a direct and sometimes cold approach to the metrics and the measures of why supporting a community like this matters. And it works most of the time to look at somebody and say, especially if it's a pro team, and say, look, you are the Arizona Cardinals. They've been our partner for 4 years. And you have a push for current blowback on pro athletes who have come out and said that they are not comfortable coming out on their team, whether it's locker room issues or whether it's not inclusive spaces or even just talk within the team and how they treat and act with that community. And yet you have two of the larger local gay flag football leagues in your city. It is extremely important for you to work with us so that we can partner you with those two leagues. It's very, very important, not just for us, but for you. And that means you put your money where your mouth is. It can be as simple as providing equipment. That's a VIK-based sponsorship partnership, whatever that is. But I think formatting that storytelling process forms sort of the bedrock of that relationship. And after that has already been laid down, then it makes talking about future partnerships and even, talking about ROI a lot easier.
So we know in the DEI space, kind of like what you're saying, storytelling is important. It's essential. It moves people. It allows you to get more grant funding. But there's this need to like make sure you're telling stories in authentic ways. And it may be challenging for people at organizations. Let's say if you want to bring more people of color in, but you don't have any people of color who are actually in the organization now, like how do you tell those stories in authentic ways to show like representation? Like if you can see it, you can be it. And that's what you're trying to do, like trying to tell that story. So how do you do that in authentic ways when maybe you don't have the representation there? And I'm just going to open that up to everyone. I know it wasn't a pre-asked question, but Connor just had me think about that. So if anyone has any thoughts, it would be helpful.
I'll take the first whack at it, and I'd love to hear
All right.
ones from everybody else if that's okay.
Yes, perfect.
So my answer to that question would be is to do your research on the back end. I think it's okay to say that we want to support ABCD for DEF reasons, but doing the research and understanding why it's important, not just for the rainbow washing example for corporations when June comes around and hey, we're going to support LGBTQ plus people because we feel it's necessary, but then July 1st comes around and everything disappears. And we know that. I mean, that's a typical fallback. We don't do that. But if it's a community of color, for example, and we work with an organization that helps with diving events specifically for kids of color, and the research on the back end would be, look, you know, her push is to specifically provide swim training for youth of color because there's a massive differential of drownings for young Black kids as there is to young white kids. That's a very real thing. They don't know how to swim. Parents don't know how to swim. The grandparents don't know how to swim. And those are real metrics. That's data. And she's trying to work on it. So that sort of research on the back end saying, look, you know, we're doing this not just because I want to teach, you know, all of my kids who come to the event how to swim. We're doing it because there is a reasoning behind it. There's a fallback we're trying to solve. There's a social issue and an obstacle that we're trying to overcome. So having that sort of back end research, I think, is extremely important in order just to lay the almost the legitimacy of your argument before you decide to tell the story.
Thank you.
I'll
Suzy?
give it a go. So to Connor's point, having that background research is super important because what I've often seen or observed in cycling is that often there are going to be clubs that are like, hey, we've been doing outreach to, you know, X, Y, and Z after school program, and we've given them free bikes and we've donated all of our time, and they don't want to do cycling. And my question is, did they want to do cycling to begin with? So having, and like seriously though, and it's not a cycling specific issue. This happened in weightlifting. This happens in all sports where we love our sport, right? Like I love weightlifting. I love cycling. So obviously everybody else is just missing out and they just don't know what they're missing out on and they're going to love it too. So I think just having a moment where you take your passion out of it, set your passion aside and ask the question of, is this what this organization needs? And what that can be a super easy like email to like the director of this after school program, that, you know, hypothetical program that exists, and say, hey, I would love to offer a program for your kids. Is this something that you're interested in? And through that conversation, you may find out, hey, you know, half of these kids like don't know how to ride a bike. They don't have an interest in riding a bike. They're actually more interested in learning about fencing or learning about, you know, basketball or something like that. And so then while it may sting a little bit, right? I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep trying to pursue a conversation. You don't want to waste your time and resources and energy on a project or a program that isn't going to continue to be sustainable long term. So all of that to say, echoing Connor's point of doing your research and having background information on what it is that you're trying to accomplish is going to help save you a headache in the long term. And it'll also help kind of break down this idea that like, oh, well, people just don't want my help, or I've tried this and I failed. You're setting yourself up for failure if you don't do the research in advance.
Oh, Lani or Shannon, did you have anything you want to add?
I think Connor and Suzy hit that one nail on the head for sure.
Great. All right. So this next questions are going to be for Shannon and Lani. So Shannon, we can start with you, but can you share any examples of programs, initiatives, or plans that you've seen throughout your career that highlight like a thoughtful engagement of sports organizations to underrepresented communities? Like how can the listeners apply this to their own organizations? And if you have any resources to suggest, here's the time to do it.
Yeah, so actually one of the organizations I was going to say is doing a good job of answering that call is USA Swimming. I think they took an approach, they, were very transparent in saying we recognize the disproportionate rates of drowning in kids who cannot swim are kids of color, and also acknowledging that these are implications of the Jim Crow era, segregation, people of color not being able to swim. So now our pledge to combating that is by being intentional and going into these communities to offer, the swimming training camps and things of the sort. So I think that was an awesome idea on their end. I think it had that level of, again, transparency. And as we talked about today, there tends to be a level of skepticism when you think about communities who have historically been marginalized. And so I think that's a great way to build trust. So I think they've been doing an awesome job with that and, partnering with a Speedo to get goggles, giving them the supplies they need. So I think they're killing it in the moment. Another example is doing some consulting work with like the Atlanta Hawks. I think what they've realized is that, recognizing the community that we're in the South in Atlanta and the culture that exists here, but that not translating to the tickets being sold. And so what they started doing was they created these like listening labs where they invited members from different communities, cultural communities, and essentially allowed them to inform what would better attract these consumers and what do we need to do to make everyone feel welcome at our stadium, at our arena. And they took all of their ideas, they again published it, made it very transparent that we realized that there's opportunities here. And then they started to slowly infuse those attributes and things that they said, we want to make sure that you all are getting to attract our consumers. And so now, they have the HBCU nights. They have nights where they're acknowledging Hispanic culture and things of the sort. So I think that's been an awesome way to build morale and engage with communities as well. So, I mean, honestly, again, I think everyone on the panel today has really talked about the biggest takeaways would be doing that background research, identifying what are your goals and what are your actionable goals, and then allowing the data to help you tell that story. And then most importantly, again, making sure that it's sustainable. And when you're developing these plans and programming, what's going to happen once you leave after a week of events in this place, or what is the impact that you're going to leave once you've left? And that does take the research. You do need to look at the numbers to tell you how to be more strategic and what partners to bring in as well. So overall, like I said, those are people who would just immediately come to mind. I think are doing a great job of answering the call of what does the community need. They've identified what they want to do better and also infusing, not only having the top down approach, but the bottom up approach to make sure that everyone is being heard, seen, and valued.
Thank you. And Lani, can you share any examples of programs, initiatives, or plans that you've seen throughout your career that highlight thoughtful engagement around these issues?
I will say, well, since I've been around, in Los Angeles alone, there are a lot of organizations that are doing the work. And I would like to really highlight Los Angeles Bicycle Academy because not only do they give out bikes, they go into the school and they are teaching the kids bike maintenance. And then we even like taught kids how to ride a bike. And then after the course, they still have an Earn a Bike program at their shop that those kids can come to later on to learn even more about the bikes. And they get to earn their own bike to keep and stuff like that. So I think a lot of organizations fail because they don't have anything after that initial contact. Like they go into places and it's like, we're going to introduce people to this. And then they come for one day or a week, whatever it is, but then there's no follow-up. There's nothing, no way to keep people engaged if they are interested. So it's like if someone does get interested in a sport or a kid does get interested in this class that is no longer there, they have nowhere to go after. So here in LA, that's one of the organizations that has that. And then from there, even after they learn about a bike, they have access to learning more about bike racing and different types, different disciplines of cycling, not just road, but mountain, gravel. So there's a lot there. Also, I love the Bahati Foundation that is based here in Los Angeles as well. That's how I learned about track cycling because they have a bike build every year for Christmas where the community comes together to help build bikes that they give out to the kids. And they have like a bike rodeo as well to kind of show the kids how to ride the bike. So there's a lot of examples there, and I know that there's more across the country that I just don't know about yet.
Well, that's great. These local stories I feel are really powerful because they show that, like, again, it doesn't have to be a national thing. It doesn't have to be, because a lot of times you see these national campaigns launched. Shannon, Suzy, you can attest to this. Like, nobody puts any money behind it. It's a big comms event. They might get a few like social media posts and then it's done. But when you have these grassroots type of initiatives where it starts small, but it's sustainable, that's really powerful.
Yeah, but they don't get the funding that these other big organizations get that are just doing it for, the look of it or for that post or that spotlight, which is basically exploiting the people in these diverse communities instead of actually helping and teaching them things and setting them up for success in this sport. So that's where, they're dropping the ball there. And it's like, how do we get that type of funding to these smaller organizations so they can do more, or take what these smaller organizations are doing and putting it on a bigger scale where more people can do it?
And I do think that has something to do with what Connor's saying about storytelling. Sometimes you're too busy doing the work, you don't get to talk about it. And sometimes people who could talk most about the work have a lot of free time because they're not doing it. So just finding that balance between the two. Let's see, Suzy, this question for you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Sorry, could I just hop off? Yeah, it's like with these small organizations, it's like a chicken or the egg situation, right? Like they need the funding so they can operationally hire more staff or like have additional help so that they can tell these stories. And so it just, again, speaking to the audience, like for all of you that are joining, I think that there is power in connecting with each other and sharing your individual stories and trying to leverage your own local community. So if you have like 4 bike clubs in your city, like reaching out and seeing how you can kind of help support each other to be more effective and being able to like apply for those grants and things like that. So strength in numbers was all I was trying to say.
yes.
Yeah.
And so, Suzy, are there any specific barriers you see in cycling that prevent the sport from kind of like reaching a broader, diverse audience? And how can cycling clubs, teams, and individuals like combat this in their own communities and make their sport more inclusive?
Yeah, this actually kind of speaks to a little bit, I think, about what Lani was talking about earlier, which is there is this sense of traditionalism in the sport of cycling. And I know that fencing is the same, where, hey, we need to reach out to people who are already on bikes. So we need to connect with USA Triathlon, or we need to connect with people who are doing Ironmans. And it's like, those people already know about USA Cycling. Like they already know that bike racing exists. And they're already the type of audience that already exists, or the type of demographic that already exists within this space. So I think that's the first challenge, right? There's this idea that we have to kind of stick in this same silo when we are surrounded by different types of silos, right? So what is it that we all have in common as cyclists? We like endurance. Maybe we love the adrenaline of competition. We love being outdoors. Maybe it would be worth reaching out to, if you're in an area like, Utah or Colorado, like, are there any ski teams or ski clubs that are around? It is also a predominantly like white group, but there are also black ski groups and snowboard groups that exist that we could reach out to and say, hey, I know you guys aren't training during the summer. Why don't you come and join us for a community ride? So thinking a little bit about where there are intersectionalities and targeting those groups for outreach, I think is a more effective use of time in terms of trying to get just focusing on like the Major Taylor organization, specifically like Major Taylor is like the biggest Black cycling organization nationwide in the US. And like, yes, that's awesome. And we should definitely keep partnering with them and keep doing outreach to them. But maybe there is a predominantly like Black or Hispanic skateboarding group based in LA. That's adventure sports, right? Like, because ultimately, like those intersectionalities are going to translate to some level of interest. Maybe they're not going to be completely gung ho and want to join your race team, but maybe it's a group that is like, hey, I am looking for community outside of skateboarding or outside of rock climbing or whatever it may be. And I'll join in, the off season from when I'm not training for that sport. So I think looking at intersectionalities is a huge area of opportunity instead of just hyper fixating on people who are already on bikes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Connor, can you share a few tips for folks who might be interested in like doing better storytelling for their own organizations to diverse audiences? Like, again, I know you do a lot of work getting content like in front of different audiences, ranges from pro sports to municipal employees. Like, how do you connect with these diverse audiences in authentic ways?
For sure, yeah. And I think this might actually piggyback off of some what everybody else was saying. And I think the overall idea, and I get it, it's complex. It's going to be kind of funny, and I think actually Suzy, Lani, and Shannon can agree with this. But when I have conversations about DEI, and I hear all kinds of stuff, I mean, I speak 15 to 20 times a year on different topics, but afterwards, when I have conversations with the audience on one-on-ones, I get to hear, exactly what level of understanding they have in DEI, and then really, where they're at. And there's no big deal wherever they're at. Everybody begins their journey at some point, and that's totally okay. But sometimes I'll hear people that say, DEI is not very complex, and that's okay, understandable. I'm not sure I agree with you, but then I've also heard people that say, actually, DEI is extremely complex. And then I'll meet people like you three, that would say, you know what, it really is not that difficult to understand, but the process to achieve what we're trying to do is extremely bewildering sometimes. So I think it's important to really dive into it and understand that, like, look, there's two major differences of providing equity. Number one, are you eradicating discriminatory policies or discriminatory practices? Number two, are you working to overcome barriers to enter? And I think that's a big piece that maybe, both the USA Cycling, USA Fencing are dealing with is if you're not actively, if you don't actively have discriminatory practices, there are still ways to provide equity. Fencing is a big one. It's a financial investment, and that's a barrier to enter. It doesn't mean you're being discriminatory because the sport is expensive, but it does mean that you can, push towards some sort of mechanisms that can maybe reduce that barrier to enter, especially for underserved communities that maybe don't have that financial dollar sign. Those are both two very, very intentional and good ways to go forward. So I think if you can identify exactly what you're trying to do, that would be the first step that you can do. Number two, I think, keep it as simple as possible. Analysis paralysis is a very, very real thing. And sometimes talking about conversations that have 200 to 300 years worth of systematic issues that layer on top of layer of complications, the deeper you dive into that rabbit hole, sometimes it leads to that sort of analysis panic where you're like, wow, these issues will never be solved. And so I don't really know what to do, and I don't know where to go. So taking it in bite-sized chunks, I think, is important. If it's a small move forward, and, plan it out for 6 months and just work on it and see if you can make some progress. I think you'd be surprised how much work 6 months of intentional effort can achieve.
And a lot of you, especially Shannon and Connor, have mentioned like, ROI, return on investment, DEI. What I hear from a lot of people who work in the space is like, it's really hard to measure progress, to measure success. What are some of the ways that you all try to measure like the value, the success, the progress of the DEI initiatives that you're doing with diverse communities? And let's see, who wants to start for this one? Because this isn't in our list, this is a random one. So anybody itching to start on this?
Shannon starts. Shannon starts.
Shannon.
That's a hard question.
Okay. I'm going to make sure I'm answering. So you said, what are ways to show the
How
impact?
are you? Like, how do you show to people that like your work is progressing? Like it may not be dollars to dollars, but progress in your work and that the work is meaningful.
Yeah. So, I mean, I will just use like, for example, the Fencing the Gap program we had. And it was essentially kind of like we said, recognizing the different barriers to entry and opportunities of engaging with people of color, people with disabilities, and things of the sort. And so, again, through this program, one of the things that we did was one of those specifically is called the GRACE program. So similar to what Connor said, where we waive fees for people who may need financial assistance. we're working with Delta now to try to make sure that we can provide travel awards for people to get to some of the major competitions. And so essentially, trying to see how do I wrap this in short. So besides that, like I said, again, we also do a series of grants to where or the clubs have to show how they're engaging with one of our 3-prong points that we're looking for. So for example, again, specifically for Fencing the Gap, we're looking at people of color, women and youth girls, and persons with disabilities. So we have, 20, 30, 50 clubs who are all applying for said grants that are specifically focusing on each of these different demographics. And so after we have, we disseminate the money outside of that, then we're looking at the end. So when we do our impact report, obviously, we're looking at what were the touch points that happened of the, say we gave away through our community partnerships, we did trial memberships. Of those, how many of those people who we gave trial memberships to ended up going to some of their local clubs? A part of that intentionality too is making sure that we're targeting, we call it fencing deserts. So I try to avoid those, at least right now, because of course, in order for it to be sustainable, you have to at least have some type of clubs that can help, especially when we're talking about lower socioeconomic status, people who may be, if they're in urban areas where there's cities, we want to make sure that we have enough people on the ground that can still meet those groups where they are. And so again, when we're doing that impact report, we're then able to show, okay, we've had these many conversions into memberships. Also, as Connor mentioned, as you're doing the storytelling, we started to have donations that are coming in that are strictly going towards D&I and want it to strictly go to Fencing the Gap specifically. So now we're starting to see more donations coming in that only want to support D&I work. So a lot of, and I'm kind of a little all over the place with it, but again, once we're showing the touch points that have been made, we've shown the number of new memberships. Another thing that we started tracking now is, since we've been providing more awareness and creating, we have our cultural community groups and doing more from a cultural standpoint, trying to be more welcoming, we've been now gauging, okay, so since the start of more D&I work from our lens, how many people of color are now registering for these events? And we're seeing the small uptick there. And so stuff like that is how you start to show the immediate change. And then of course, over time, as we say, hey, we want to see a 3% increase in people of color in the sport. And now we're starting to see that track up. And so a lot of that is where we set the initial goal of again, setting those percentages, and it may be based off of, for example, the U.S. Census is where some people will just start by saying, from a base level, we want our demographics to reflect that. And then you start to be more intentional in creating your specific goals from there. But then along the way, like I said, showing the conversions, showing the partners that are interested in the work, showing that the funding is coming as restricted to our department is also showing the impact that's being made.
Excellent. Anybody else have any other strategies too?
I don't have anything to add to that, Lani, Suzy.
Shannon hit all of the ones that I use. So
Yeah. All right.
great job,
Good.
Shannon.
I do like that you talk about benchmarking too. You don't know if you're showing any progress unless you had a goal that maybe you're inching towards. So that's really good. So for our final question, it's going to be for everyone. We're going to start with Lani. So let's just close out by touching briefly again on best practices for engaging diverse and underrepresented communities. What should the listeners take away from this conversation?
For best practices for engaging diverse audiences, what they should take away, well, I think most is you have to collaborate. You need to look within your field and find the people that are already there, the diverse people that are already there, and get, some feedback from them. I think, again, the intentionality that was spoken about, authenticity, know why you want to reach out to the diverse audiences, not just because it's trending, not just because you feel you should be. You have to genuinely want to help in some way, or really want to get more people into your sport, not just to do it for funding or to get grants and stuff like that. I would say look up clubs and stuff. You can look up clubs on Facebook or Instagram because there's tons of clubs already out there. They're just smaller. They're not as big. Like you know Major Taylor because they're the biggest Black club, but there's so many more. I mean, there's clubs all on the East Coast. There's clubs over here in Los Angeles that are just smaller. And obviously USA Cycling has a list of all the clubs, so reach out that way. That's all I got right now. I'm sorry.
Oh, great. Connor, I have you up next.
No, I love that. The that engagement I think is super big. I'd love to piggyback off that what Lonnie said too. And I think at least the way that I approach most of the work that we do is I do it in a very direct fashion. Having that background knowledge, the understanding, knowing, what ROI actually means on a DEI perspective, trying to make sure that we actually move towards the goals that we're trying to accomplish as a strategic imperative. It's not just a um, obligation, like I said before. It is very much, to bolster your organizations strategically, to bolster your organizations. It would benefit you to support specific and achievable OKRs in your strategic planning report that involve DEI. Those kinds of things can produce good results, and they can also produce dollars if maybe a financial barrier to enter is prominent in your sport. So I think it's okay to talk about DEI in a very purposeful and intentional manner, that it can result in yield positive membership growth and dollars. I don't think that's dishonoring anything involved in the community. I think it's okay to admit that and to push for that.
Thank you. Shannon?
Yeah, I think they both shared some really good things. The only thing I would add to that too is when you're going into those communities, again, as we mentioned before in the call, that sometimes there is just a historical level of skepticism of people coming in. And it goes back to, are you just doing it because it looks good right now and there's a push for it? Or how are you really going to help us? And I think that has really been shown, especially with, like, for example, people working with HBCUs. And what you'll find in those rooms and those communities right now is that the people who they're trying to partner with are safeguarding those students. And they want to know, okay, yeah, you want to work with us, but so do 5 million other people because it looks good. So I need a real succinct plan of how, if you engage with us, how are you going to continue to help our students? How are our students going to get jobs? How are our students going to learn this new trade or learn this new sport? And so a lot of that gaining trust is going in. And as Connor mentioned too, maybe you go in saying, we recognize that there's a gap. We don't have the answer and we want to figure out that answer with you. And that's a way to start those conversations and continue to build trust, but showing those members of the community how you plan to long-term keep them engaged is a perfect way to start relationships.
Suzy, want to close us out?
Man, last one, best one, right? So for me, I mean, I think the key takeaway that I would love for you all to think about is being intentional, right? Like you don't have to put together this broad sweeping program, because I feel like especially at the club level, people get overwhelmed with this idea that like I have to create this huge thing and I don't have the capacity for it, and you get stuck in this like cyclical, like I'm not doing enough, I don't have enough time. You can start small and that is allowed, but however you choose to start, be intentional with it and make sure that you're centering whatever it is that you choose to do as something that is important and not something that you're just doing on the side. So if that means that, hey, as part of my onboarding process, I'm gonna send my coaches through an implicit bias training, or as part of my onboarding process, I'm just going to make sure that I verbally talk to whoever my new coach may be or my new athlete may be and say, hey, this is a club where we welcome everyone and where everyone is to be respected. Those are small things that you can do that don't take a ton of time that will have an impact on the culture of your club. And I think that taking those like small little steps will eventually lead you to those bigger overarching projects that you eventually want to get to as a club. So I think, yeah, so be intentional, and you are allowed to start small. That is okay.
Right, great. Thank you all so much. This is an amazing panel. You all are doing great things. It's been an honor to be here with you today. Suzy, did you want to say any final things to close us out?
I think we did have two questions that popped up, and I just wanted to speak to one that was brought up specifically around rural locations and if there isn't space like in rural communities to do outreach. Honestly, the easiest way, at least from my perspective, has been to try to work with the community, like community centers that are specifically owned by the city. That's usually the best way that you can kind of get around not having like a fencing club or a cycling club. That's just, yeah, something I wanted to throw out in response. But anyway, other than that, thank you all so much for joining. We are not going to be doing breakout rooms because this is set up as a webinar, but I did email out a post-session worksheet. So if you could fill that out just as a reflection, it's something for you to keep on hand to remind yourself about what it is that you're going to be working on as a result of attending this education. That would be awesome. If you have any feedback, there will be a survey that is coming out on Monday for you all to provide us with feedback on this event. But yeah, so thank you all so much for your time. Ashland, did you want to close with anything?
No, again, I've enjoyed being a part of this whole process. I know we started it a little while ago, and I love that you've all taken initiative to like end it on such a strong note. So thank you for having us involved.
Awesome. Thank you, Connor, Liam, Shannon, Lani, Milt, all of our panelists. You are all so amazing. And of course, the Inclusion Playbook, great organization. For those of you that are watching or attending, please check them out. They have a list of amazing resources on their website that you can download to learn more. All right.
Cool. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the involvement.